This is the first lesson for the first unit in life science, which deals with the characteristics of life and classification. The first thing I would like you to do is to put your first and last name on the blank provided and circle your class period. The first lesson deals with the characteristics of life. You can find more information in Chapter 2, Section 1, pages 38 to 41 in your life science textbook. The next thing I would like you to do is to write down the following sentence in the blank space near the top of your paper under the heading that says Lesson 1, Characteristics of Life. Biogenesis is the theory that states that living things come only from other living things. If you need to hear that sentence again, please pause and rewind, listen to it again, and write it down. Then, please underline the word biogenesis. Prior to the theory of biogenesis, people believed in spontaneous generation, which stated that lower forms of living things, such as insects, came from non-living things. Another example was people thought that if you put a dirty cloth over a pot of wheat, that mice would come from it in 21 days. The first evidence in disproving spontaneous generation came from an experiment by an Italian scientist named Francisco Redi. Redi showed that maggots will appear in uncovered meat, but not on meat in a closed container. Why? They came from eggs laid in the uncovered meat by flies. And here's a picture of his experiment. Here is the uncovered jar that got flies, and then these are the covered jars that had no contamination of fly eggs. Now let's get into the actual characteristics of life. The first characteristic of life states that all living things are composed of cells. A cell is a membrane-covered structure that contains all the materials necessary for life. Here are several examples of cells. Here are several kinds of cells under microscopes. Here is a plant cell, and here is an animal cell. Cells regularly look different from other cells depending on the type of cell they are. As we continue to study cells, we find that some organisms are made up of trillions of cells, like this cat. It's considered a multicellular organism. Those organisms have different kinds of cells that perform specialized functions. Each cell may be responsible for something else in that body. In single-cell organisms, such as this organism, in the lower right-hand corner, different parts of the cell perform different functions. It does not have the same abilities as multicellular organisms, so different parts of that cell are responsible for different functions. The second characteristic of life states that all living things have the ability to sense change in their environment and to respond to that change. A change that affects the activity of an organism is called a stimulus. Stimuli that can cause an organism to respond include chemicals, gravity, light, sounds, touch, and hunger, among others. In this picture, we can see that a fly has touched the outside hairs of the Venus flytrap. That acts as a stimulus to the Venus flytrap, and it closes in on the fly and will consume it. Survival of an organism depends on chemical reactions inside the cell. Right now, there are tons of chemical reactions going on inside of your body. Those reactions can only take place when conditions are exactly right. The maintenance of a stable internal environment is called homeostasis. Animals respond to change in their environment in a variety of ways. Humans twitch their muscles when they get cold. This is called shivering. Animals can move to a warmer climate when the temperature turns colder. They can move into the shade when it's hot, or they can move into the sun if it's cold. There is a specific example of reptiles using the sun or shade to warm or cool their bodies. Now let's move on to the third characteristic of life that states that all living things reproduce. Organisms need to make other organisms like themselves in order for the species to survive. They do so in one of two ways: by sexual reproduction and by asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, two parents produce offspring that will share characteristics of both. Most plants and animals, including humans, reproduce in this way. In asexual reproduction, one parent produces offspring that are identical to that parent. Most single-celled organisms reproduce in this way. In this example, we have a baby. It was produced through sexual reproduction and shares characteristics from both its mother and its father. In this example, we have a hydra. It creates a bud that is an exact replica of its parent and eventually breaks off, and there are two identical organisms. The fourth characteristic of life states that all living things have DNA. Now, I want you to add a sentence that goes up the right side of your paper. It should say, "The DNA in the average human body would measure about 20 billion kilometers. It would stretch from the Sun to Pluto about 4 times." If you did not get everything from the first time listening to it, please rewind the video and write it down, and then move on. The cells of all living things contain the molecule deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. DNA controls the structure and function of cells. Here is a cartoon depiction of a strand of DNA. As you can see, it forms into a double helix. When organisms reproduce, they pass copies of their DNA to their offspring. This ensures that the offspring will resemble their parents. In the case of sexual reproduction, parent 1 passes on half of their DNA, parent 2 passes on half of their DNA, and they create offspring that looks something like the parents, usually a combination. The passing of traits from one generation to the next is called heredity. At the end of the section, please look over your notes and write down the list of the 6 characteristics of life in the space provided at the end of section 1. The fifth characteristic of life states that all living things use energy. Some organisms can make their own energy, while other organisms must consume things to get energy for their bodies. Organisms need and use energy to carry out the daily activities of life. These activities include such things as making food, breaking down food, moving materials into and out of cells, and building cells. An organism's metabolism is the total of all of the chemical activities that the organism performs. We all know that we have to eat to get energy. So here is an example of a person eating food, and then our bodies must break that food down to give us energy. In our cells, to get energy, they must bring in objects into the cell, so they move materials into that cell, and they move waste out. The final characteristic of life that we will be talking about states that all living things grow and develop. Single-celled organisms have cells that grow during periods of their lives and then divide, making duplicate organisms. Multicellular organisms, like again this cat, also grow by cells getting larger and by increasing the number of cells. In addition to getting larger, living things may develop and change as they grow. Many plants and animals go through this kind of development. Here we can see a plant seed growing and developing into a full-grown plant. In this example, we can see a baby growing and developing as it gets older, and it obtains new skill sets such as standing up and running. We have come to the end of Lesson 1 of Characteristics of Life.